By the way, I've talked to Ryan Warner in the last week, wing historian out at Scott, and he and his family do again thank the Dixon Camp for their support, and particularly their participation in the funeral for our fallen compatriot Brett. Ryan also told me personally he appreciated last month's Dixon Blue Light with the salute to his father in my monthly column. And as I mentioned, I broke with the normal sesquicentennial presentation to salute Brett Warner, who was truly one of the stalwarts of this group. And again, I mentioned this month's column to point out the single biggest event that happened in April 1862 was at the end of the first week of the month. And that, of course, was the Battle of Pittsburg Landing, named for the point of land, or the landing, literally boat landing, on the bank of the Tennessee River, where the two Western armies, one from the Union side and one from the Confederate side, met in what became one of the most vicious, bloody, albeit somewhat short, two-day battles of the war. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And I would ask you to think about the events. April 1861 is when Fort Sumter took place. What kind of year it had been for the Confederate States of America? It had been a pretty tough year. If you could advance the slide, please. During the course of 1 year, now obviously the South won the first major battle in the East, the First Manassas, which took place in July 1861. P.G.T. Beauregard and Jackson made his name there, all sorts of famous figures. I can't think of the Union commander's name all of a sudden. McDowell. I wanted to say O'Donnell. McDowell ended his career there pretty much. If you want to go a little lesser, the Confederates won the Battle of Ball's Bluff up on the Potomac. That was another Confederate victory. So initially, at least, the Confederates rattled off a couple of victories. And generally, and if you haven't noticed, this hasn't changed really up into the modern era. If stuff happens on the East Coast, it tends to make the national news. If stuff happens west of the Appalachians, sometimes it makes the national news. Our storm the other day in St. Louis made the national news, partly because a poor gentleman died down in the downtown St. Louis because of the windstorm. And it's pretty much the same thing, too, back in the Civil War. Part of that is a function of distance. It was real easy for reporters to get out of the big cities like D.C., go into the field, watch the Union Army run like crazy, and then realize they were out alone and run after them, writing their reports. Out here in the West, and this was the West at the time, didn't get near the coverage. So like battles like Wilson's Creek, which was a Union victory, was actually it was a draw, but the Confederates drew back into northern Arkansas. It prevented a threat to Missouri, kept it in the Union, was a Union victory overall. They didn't get near the coverage. This was a huge battle, Shiloh, but leading up to it, there were several very notable Confederate losses. After Manassas, the North had psychological. They'd been beaten. Not only beaten, but beaten badly. Beaten in front of the world, beaten in front of the press, beaten in front of Congress. You remember the stories at Manassas. Congressmen came out, business leaders, set up picnic tables, watched the glorious Union victory. Didn't work out that way, and they had to run just like everybody else. The North was starved for victories. The North was starved for good generals. The Confederacy was about the same way. They had some good generals. They had some that were coming to the forefront. There were some that still hadn't really proven themselves, number one being Robert E. Lee, if you notice from my column this month. He didn't start making his name really until June of 1862. So when there were victories for the North, they were trumpeted. The news got back east. Fort Henry, which fell 6 February 1862, primarily due to the efforts of the Union Navy on the Tennessee River. Fort Donelson, which fell on 10 February 1862, opened up the Cumberland River. I gave a presentation the other night for the Civil War Roundtable on Fort Island Number 10, the Battle of New Madrid, and the Battle for Memphis. This is all part of what was known as the Anaconda Plan that was devised by General Winfield Scott, who at the start of the war was the General-in-Chief of the Union Army. And the whole point of the Anaconda Plan, as the title implies, and I've got a cartoon that goes with it from the period, draw a big snake around the southern United States, an open ocean blockade across the Gulf, go up to the Mississippi River, and then start working down the interior rivers. Now, when Scott came out with the Anaconda Plan, a lot of people poo-pooed it. One, he was an old man. A lot of people had problems with him anyway because of his age, kind of slow thinking, very slow moving if you've seen pictures of him. But his plan as it turned out. And the other issues were the Union Navy was in no condition at the start of the war to blockade anything. They didn't have a fleet, per se. The Union Navy had no experience operating on rivers. That was a drawback. And, of course, the Union Army was a very small frontier force at the start of the war. The idea of taking the war to the south, beyond the obvious ones like on to Richmond, was foreign. Nobody knew how they were going to do it. That's what led Lincoln to call up for all the states to contribute troops by the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. So on those occasions when the Union actually won a battle after Manassas, it was a big deal. And this also was part, as it turned out, part of the program really initiated by Winfield Scott, which was to go up the Mississippi, open it, or actually come down the Mississippi for the most part, come in from both ends, split the Confederacy in two, and give them access to the interior of the South. Because while in the East they were still doing the on to Richmond thing, particularly under McClellan, out in the West they were looking for ways to take down Southern industry and tie down the Southern Army that was operating out in the West. That was the key for winning the war. And this is what led to the Battle of Shiloh. Next slide, please. Now, the senior Confederate commander in the West was Albert Sidney Johnston, and I'll get to him in a second. The senior Union commander in the West was Henry Wager Halleck. I think one of his nicknames was Old Brains. He was a very thoughtful general. He did a lot of thinking, spent a lot of time thinking and planning and occasionally plotting against other generals. And he was commander of the Department of Missouri, which was headquartered in St. Louis. And he ran the entire Western War for the first year or so. His two primary subordinates going into the April of 1862 were the newly promoted Major General U.S. Grant, who'd started the war as a captain in the Illinois militia. In fact, he got promoted to Major General after Fort Donelson, after he gave them a victory. And Major General Don Carlos Buell. Interesting chain of command here. Halleck was responsible for the entire Western theater. He had two armies under him. The army of what was originally what was called the Army of Western Tennessee, which became the Army of the Tennessee, and the Army of Ohio, or the Ohio, I'm sorry, they named them after rivers generally. None of these guys liked each other. None of them trusted each other. Halleck was a schemer. If he thought somebody was getting too much fame and fortune, he would push him out of the way. This happened to Grant at least once, maybe twice. And nobody trusted Grant anyway because he was a drunkard, obviously. Everybody knew the story. This guy had a drinking problem. So Buell was very touchy about someone else getting accolades and awards and cheers in front of him. And it's just fate just happened to make it that where these three generals had to work together to help control and subjugate the West and take care of the Confederate Army. Now, what happened was towards the middle of March 1862, Halleck ordered Grant to take his army and move it up the Tennessee River in an attempt to start working his way into the interior of the Western Confederacy. He also ordered Don Carlos Buell with the Army of the Ohio to leave Nashville and meet Grant at some point on the Tennessee River. That point was Pittsburg Landing. So Grant moved his army to Pittsburg Landing. Buell started moving his army to Pittsburg Landing. What they put together there, under Grant alone, Grant had 6 divisions totaling 50,000 men. Moved them all up to Western Tennessee and up to Pittsburg Landing. The division commanders were Major Generals John McClernand, Major General Lew Wallace, Brigadier Generals W.H.L. Wallace, Stephen Hurlbut, William T. Sherman, and Benjamin Prentiss. Next slide, please. Opposing them was the greatest general in the Confederacy, Albert Sidney Johnston. At least that's what Davis thought. That's what about everybody thought. This was their best field commander. And he commanded the entire Western theater, which was basically everything from roughly Ohio all the way down to the Gulf Coast of New Orleans. He had an interesting background. He originally served in the Army of the Republic of Texas during the Texas dust-up with Mexico. He joined the U.S. Army, fought in the Mexican War. After the Mexican War, he was one of the first cavalry commanders, commanded the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, had a lot of experience fighting the Comanche in Texas. If I remember, the 2nd U.S. Cavalry had several other famous generals people assigned who later became generals, including Robert E. Lee, Jim Longstreet, George Thomas, William P. Rogers, others. It was a breeding ground for great commanders of the Civil War. Of course, they didn't know it at the time. At the time the war started, Johnston was the commander of the U.S. Army's Department of the West, or Department of the Pacific, headquartered in San Francisco. He resigned his commission, went south to Los Angeles, enlisted as a private in a militia company formed in L.A., of all places, to fight for the Confederacy, and came back east with them overland. Once he came into the Confederate States, he was ushered to Richmond, and he was promoted to 4-star general, for all intents and purposes, one of the first 5. In fact, he was the second highest ranking general in the Confederacy early in the war. And he was put in charge of the Western Department. His army totaled about 55,000 men. And after the fall of Fort Henry and Donelson, he consolidated his army in northern Mississippi, parts of Tennessee, and northern Alabama. Eventually, they coalesced in Corinth, which played a major part in the war for both sides at several times. So you got Fort Henry here, Fort Donelson here on the Cumberland. After those fights, the Southern forces under Johnston moved south, rebuilt, reorganized. This is later in the war. This shows a bunch of things that happened later. And then decided to take on Grant, who was just happened to be forming up his army just a few miles away up here at Pittsburg Landing. So they worked from here down to here, got their act together, and moved back up. 55,000 men, consisted of 3 corps under General Leonidas Polk, Major General Braxton Bragg, and Major General William Hardee, each with 2 to 3 divisions. Had a standalone division under John Breckinridge, had 2 reserve brigades, plus he had a brigade of cavalry under Brigadier General John Bowen. First week of April, Grant and his men, his army, are at Pittsburg Landing. They're spread out. They're in bivouac. They're not in defensive positions. They didn't think they needed them. They didn't think the Confederates were anywhere near. They didn't really know where Johnston was. They knew something about Johnston was forming up an army or trying to stir up some trouble in the region, but nobody believed he was anywhere near Pittsburg Landing. Nice, safe, idyllic, lovely sunsets, fishing. Sounds like a resort, right? Everybody relax. Grant spent most of his time drilling his men. Buell was ordered to Savannah, Tennessee, which is about 20 miles away, and he set up camp there. So there's a problem right there now. We've got this Union Army, which, if they get together, could probably put 75,000 men in the field, but they're separated by 20 miles. Way back then, particularly when you figure you got major waterways, which require boat traffic to get people across rivers, swamps, lowlands, lots of forests, they might as well have been on the moon. So you got 20,000 men one place about 15 to 20 miles away, and you got the main force of the Army, 55,000, scattered around Pittsburg Landing. And I do mean scattered. They were spread out all over the place. It was primarily designed for comfort and for drill. Grant did not put in trenches, did not put in defenses. In his memoirs, he later explained, "The troops with me, officers and men, needed discipline and drill more than they did experience with the pick, shovel, and axe. Under these circumstances, I concluded that drill and discipline were worth more to our men than fortifications." And again, the general thought was, Confederates aren't anywhere near. Now, Grant had some cavalry assigned to him, but he did not have a cavalry command assigned to him. He didn't have one. It's still early in the war, and again, this is the Western Theater. The famous cavalry commanders are learning their trade back east. Obviously, Jeb Stuart for the South. Other guys like Kirkpatrick, or Kill Cavalry, as he was called, for the North, and some other cavalry commanders. So he didn't really have scouts that could go out a long distance independently, ride around, and figure out if there were any bad guys in the area. So they really, really didn't know the Confederacy was close by, the Confederate forces. I will also point out, with Buell, some 20 miles away, this was one of those rare occasions that occurred during the war. And if you're familiar with the campaigns of the Army in Northern Virginia, this rarely happened. The two armies are about the same size. This did not happen very often during the war. So here's a splendid opportunity for Johnston, one of the best generals in the South, to take it to the Union and possibly destroy the Western Army. If he can destroy Grant or split Grant's army up and send him running from the field, the South will further consolidate, not just northern Mississippi, but that puts them in a good position to continue to control Arkansas, retake Missouri, take western Tennessee, take western Kentucky. So this is a magnificent opportunity for General Johnston. Johnston put his men in advance of the battle, which started on April 6th, 3 miles from the Union positions without them being detected. Johnston's second in command, P.G.T. Beauregard, hero of Fort Sumter, did okay as a combat commander at the 1st Manassas, had a pretty good reputation, was noted for pretty good habits in the field, but he was also something of a cautious individual. Not near as cautious as Joe Johnston's reputation later in the war. But Beauregard, as they worked their way up towards the Union Army, as the Army of Mississippi started crawling up on the Army of the Tennessee, was very, very nervous. Because like I said, they got within 3 miles of this point, an entire army of 50,000 men without being detected. Beauregard was convinced every time he heard a horse whinny, or somebody trip and cuss, or somebody clatter metal pots together, he kind of freaked, to use the modern term. He just went, God, this is it, they heard us. And he turned to Johnston and say, sir, we got to pull back. There's no way we're going to surprise them now. And Johnston said, absolutely not. They don't know we're here. Other limiting factors, though, that did affect this. The vast majority of the people fighting under Johnston had no combat experience. The vast majority were poorly dressed, poorly equipped. Weapons were antiques for the most part, very old stuff. Basic, muskets. Some of them, I saw one reference, some of them reported for battle carrying pikes, like you use to unhorse a soldier or a knight or something like that. Whereas the Union forces had a lot of good weapons, most of them brand new, and fully half of Grant's army had recent combat experience. Columbus, Belmont, Fort Donelson, so they were combat-proven soldiers. That could make a difference. Beauregard, who was still nervous right up to the time on the morning of the 6th when they first hit the Union line, wrote just before the battle, in the struggle tomorrow, we shall be fighting men of our own blood, Western men who understand the use of firearms. This struggle will be a desperate one. He was very prophetic in that sense. First day's battle. Here's the actual landing. Sherman's troops tend to be up here. Sherman had his headquarters up here. Here's the Tennessee River. Here's the Confederate forces coming in. Here's the Union forces spread out all over Hell's Half Acre. I mean, look at them. They're all over the place, okay? Confederate forces, interesting point, the main attack took place at 6 a.m., and as you've heard and seen depicted in some venues, pretty much routed the Unions right out of their tents and their camps, sent them running. In many cases, the Confederate troops, once they cleared a camp, stopped and started cleaning out the camp. A lot of Confederates dropped their old weapons, picked up brand new Springfield rifles or whatever they could find. A lot of them stopped and got food, because one thing that was common throughout the war for the Confederate forces, they never had enough food. Some of them got clothes, whatever. This led to some rumors, which I'll discuss in a little bit, about the Confederate conduct of the battle. But Johnston sent his forces basically in line abreast, 3 divisions wide with 3 divisions to the rear, or 2 divisions to the rear. Just sent them sweeping in. Johnston's plan was this. What he wanted to do, really, was to come in like this, hit the river, and push forces back up this way. This is all swamp up here, almost impenetrable. He figured he could disperse the Union forces and destroy them at his leisure, using his strong forces who are still on the dry ground and can get around easily. What he did, like I just described, was basically a line abreast. He had 3 divisions in a row and sent them in a straight line and started pushing the Union. And initially he saw great success. Beauregard, when he realized that Johnston wasn't going to listen to him about, maybe we better pull back and try another day, came up with a better idea. He recommended 1, maybe 2 divisions in front, followed by additional divisions as reserves. 1st Division runs into obstruction. Union finally gets its act together and starts fighting. Break off the 1st Division, which probably suffered a lot of casualties. Send in a 2nd fresh division. When that one's worn out, send in a 3rd fresh division. When that's worn out, throw in whatever else you got. He wanted to hit one specific point, preferably down in here, and drive to the river, and then spread out the reserves and push them into the swamp. They didn't do that. They followed Johnston's guidance, and what happened was, in and around the surprisingly rapid collapse of the Union line, and it wasn't a line. That's a bad term on my part. Like I said, they were all camped out. There was no line. There was no defense. The surprising collapse of the Union and their race for the back, and particularly to the river and hopefully safety, the Confederates, in and around some units stopping to pillage and plunder, also tended to get intermixed. Command broke down. Johnston rode up front. He rode into the battle in front of his men. Again, this is the 2nd most senior general officer in the entire Confederate States. You've all heard stories, and these may come up in future presentations, later in the war, of the generals who led, to use a current phrase, led from behind. Battle of Petersburg, one Union general led from behind in a bomb-proof with a large bottle of spirits. But anyway, that's another story. He sent Beauregard in the back basically to run logistics, try to keep an eye on the battle. This is the 1860s. It's hard to keep track of what's going on any kind of distance other than using runners and couriers, and make sure troops were fed in as necessary. So the Confederates went in and swept the field, at least the first day. Interesting point. The Union actually initiated the first contact that morning, 5:15 in the morning. The 25th Missouri, their colonel, this guy named Everett Peabody, got nervous. He smelled Confederates. He knew there were Confederates out there. So he sent his infantry out to prowl around right down in here. And sure enough, they ran into Confederate pickets, deployed in such a way to indicate that they were the advance warning or barrier for a much larger force. He went back and advised his immediate division commander. Apparently the word never got up the line. This is 45 minutes before the actual Confederate attack. Sherman had one of his Ohio colonels come up to him. General, this isn't right. Something's not right here. I suspect we have Confederates in the area, and we may be in for a big fight. Sherman said to his colonel, quote, "Take your damned regiment back to Ohio. There is no enemy nearer than Corinth." So the colonel went back to his regiment. He didn't go back to Ohio. He and his regiment actually fought throughout the two-day battle. Okay. 7:30 a.m., Beauregard had ordered in Polk and Breckinridge. By this time, the line is up and down in here. It's really confused. It's really a mess. Polk and Breckinridge, instead of maybe going around one end or the other, kind of got mixed in with them. So they're continuing to push the Union back. It's a very near-run thing. The Union troops, like I said, instead of going into the swamp, they were able to head to the river up here around Pittsburg Landing. There were two Union gunboats, the USS Lexington and the USS Tyler, which helped provide the modern term naval gunfire support to help hold back the Confederates. The battle broke down quickly. The morning was pretty much a Confederate rout. By noontime, the Union was starting to stiffen in several locations. Sherman, to his credit, recovered quickly. In fact, he recovered quicker than Grant, and led his troops from the front, ran back and forth up along the lines trying to rally the men. Had 3 horses shot out from under him and was wounded twice. Both wounds were fairly minor, but just the same, he was in the middle of it. Grant, when all this started, was actually at Savannah, 15 miles down the river, heard the sound of the guns, heard the artillery, and using crutches went to the nearest boat in order to go directly to Pittsburg Landing. So Grant wasn't even here when the Confederate forces under Johnston attacked. Grant, the day before, had a horse fall on him, really messed up his leg. He couldn't walk without crutches. He could ride. So as soon as he got to Pittsburg Landing, jumped on a horse with his staff, rode towards the sound of the guns. So you got Grant and Sherman both in the field. Now this is going on. Grant also put out word to Buell, get here as soon as possible with your entire army of roughly 20,000 men. Buell wasn't quite sure the best way to approach the battlefield, so he kind of went here and he kind of went there, and then he sent a couple dispatches to Grant. Please verify your comment as fast as possible. Do you really mean as fast? Stuff like that. The fog of war, a little stalling on his part for whatever reason. The end result is only 17,000 of his men would actually make it into the battle, roughly one division, and that would be very, very late in the day. They did make it, but it wasn't until the end of the first day's fight. The key for the first day, next slide, is the famous Hornets Nest, or Sunken Road, which is right up in the middle of what's now Shiloh Battlefield. 2 divisions under Brigadier General Benjamin Prentiss and Brigadier General William H. Wallace, about 9 a.m., picked this, as they call it, a sunken road, and the park rangers will tell you there's not really a sunken road there. It is kind of a sunken road now because of 150 years of people walking up and down, oohing and ahhing. Put their divisions in line next to each other, lined up what little artillery they had, and fought like hell. The Confederates repeatedly attacked the Hornets' Nest and attempted to dislodge the division. This is what broke the Confederate attack on the first day. They could not get past these 2 divisions. The Union lines on both sides, if we were looking at the map on the previous page, Confederates are pushing them in. They're kind of pushing them towards the river. The Hornets' Nest is in the middle. The lines bent on both sides. The Hornets' Nest held. The Union guys put up a big fight, a really good one. Wallace was killed. Well, mortally wounded. He died a couple days later. Like you see, the lines are bending back. Hornets Nest is in here. Here's Bloody Pond. Here's the Peach Orchard. Those are other two famous battle sites. These two generals and their divisions held the line. Roughly, Walter, a division was how many men? About 10,000? About 10,000. They held them off for the day. Finally, the Confederate infantry, the commanders at the front with the Confederate infantry said, let's go around them, which they did. And they continued towards the river. The Southerners then brought in 50 cannon and at point-blank range shelled the Hornets' Nest. At the end of the day, the surviving General Prentiss decided it was time to surrender. They'd done their part. He surrendered 2,400 men. Everybody else was killed or got away. Most of them were killed, or a lot of them were killed. But their action allowed Grant and Sherman to set up a defensive line for the first time around Pittsburg Landing, backed on the water by the Union gunboats. So this is what saved the day for the Union. The other big event of the day was Johnston dying. Now who's not familiar with the story of Johnston's death? It's okay if you haven't heard the story. You all know the story?
Sharon.
Took around? Sharon doesn't know it? Okay, you volunteered you. Incoming. Johnston, like I said earlier, led from the front. Believed the commander's place was at the front. He was up front with his staff. He took a bullet in the leg. I actually wrote down which leg, I think. Left leg. He's wearing these big, long cavalry boots. You know, they kind of go, the John Merritt boots, you know, they come way up to here. Okay. Boot filled with blood. The mini ball cut an artery. We have any medical types here? Anybody's had emergency medical training? Arterial bleeding? Huh? Walter. Okay. You know what happened? He stayed on his horse. He's upright. His boot literally filled with his blood. He kept pushing his men, kept trying to give orders. The opening slide shows him, and we can go back to it later, shows him rallying the Arkansas troops. And then he grew faint, and with much to the surprise of everybody, because they didn't know he'd been hit, and he apparently thought it was just a flesh wound, fell off his horse. And here's the second major thing that, oh dear, wish he hadn't done this moment. He had dispatched his regimental surgeon, or his divisional surgeon, his command surgeon, to another part of the battlefield with help with the wounded there. His staff, to their credit, pulled the boot off, found what was happening, but none of them really knew what to do with an arterial bleeding situation. They could not save him. He died. Blood loss. Yes, Walter?
Stephen Woodworth, he also points out that Johnston had a tourniquet in his pocket.
Oh, wow. See? If they found the tourniquet, if they knew how to use the tourniquet, they may have if they'd found it. Or even use a belt, a cartridge belt. They might have saved him. They would have saved his life. Who knows what would have... This is one of those classic what-ifs, and the war is full of those what-ifs. The greatest general in the South by reputation. I'll point out, by reputation. This was his first really big battle. Bled to death in the battlefield. The command fell to P.G.T. Beauregard. As I mentioned, Beauregard tended to be rather cautious. Beauregard decided initially, let's keep the attacks going on the Hornets' Nest, which was a mistake. But eventually, like I said, the Hornets' Nest finally capitulated. Towards the end of the day, with maybe an hour, 90 minutes of daylight, a couple of Johnston's, now Beauregard's division commanders, or corps commanders came to him and said, look, we've got them up against the river. If we go in from the south, continue pushing through here, with our main thrust, we can probably still cut them off, because Grant and his men are trying to cut a line right about here. Beauregard looked around, saw the sun was going down. He said, I think we're done for the day. Put his men in bivouac for the night. The end of the day, the Union line, the Grant-Sherman line built was about like this. Going through the night, Buell arrived. His first reinforcements joined in on the defensive line. Sherman on the right, McClernand in the center, Wallace, Hurlburt, Stewart, and what was left of their corps on the left side of the line. They had 50 cannons lined up now, and they had the two gunboats, Lexington and Tyler. Interesting couple of quotes. At the end of day one, and this one's rather famous, you may have heard it. Grant was talking with Sherman, and Sherman looked at Grant and said, well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we? And Grant was smoking a cigar, and he took a puff and took the cigar out of his mouth and said, yep, we'll lick them tomorrow, though. Something I found out doing my research. Another couple of famous officers on the other side of the line also had a summary of the day's actions. The Confederate cavalry commander, a colonel named Nathan Bedford Forrest, told one of the division commanders, a guy named Pat Cleburne, if the enemy comes on us in the morning, we will be whipped like hell. Some of the lower-level division commanders realized they'd had their chance and was probably already gone. But, of course, you're in contact with the enemy. They're in front of you. You're in front of them. There's going to be another day's battle. But in the meantime, Beauregard, at the end of the day, cabled President Davis and claimed a complete victory. There's still close to 35,000 Union soldiers here, including the 17,000 that have come in from Buell across the river, down the river. On the Confederate side, effectives, those that can still fight, who aren't wounded, run out of food, run out of ammunition. Confederate side by now is down below 20,000. They've lost almost more than half their forces for one reason or another. They won the first day, but at a very terrible cost. A lot of people just left the battlefield. So they're set up for day two. Oh, by the way, some of Beauregard's staff said, oh, by the way, General Buell has arrived with the Army of the Ohio. Beauregard went, no big deal. We'll take care of them in the morning. Same thing. They won't make that much of a difference. Second day was the Union's turn. Lines had drawn back during the night. A nice, solid position. This time they did dig some fortifications, and well, not forts, but trenches and stuff, defensive positions. And to return the favor promptly at first light, they attacked through across the entire line and slammed into the Confederate forces, who were also arrayed in a line. This time it was the Confederates who had trouble. Here's the numbers. I just gave some earlier. I was off. 45,000 total Union soldiers went south and collided with 28,000 effectives on the Confederate side. That's out of the original roughly 50,000. The men had, like I said, worn out, little food and water, poorly equipped. A lot of the Confederates, though, did have brand new rifles, courtesy of the Yankees, who they flushed the first day. Polk had camped several miles away the previous night. That's one of the reasons the Confederate forces were down low. He had an entire corps. He was ordered to the front. He didn't make it on time. About 10 a.m., Beauregard managed to stabilize the lines, but he ordered an abandonment. He ordered a retreat to Corinth because he realized he could not win. Confederates had lost, by the end of the second day, middle of the second day, had lost over 10,000 and were running out of ammunition. They didn't have a resupply capability. So he put Breckinridge out in the back to cover their force with a large number of artillery, and at 5 p.m. on the second day, Beauregard ordered the retreat back southwest towards Corinth. Grant had an opportunity here. This was kind of repeated by Meade at Gettysburg. This was repeated in several other battles during the war. If Grant had pursued, he probably would have wiped out the entire army of Mississippi, Beauregard's army, formerly Johnston's army. He didn't do it. He felt his men were also wiped out, tired. It had been a terrible 2 days for them, obviously. The other half of his army now had combat experience. It wasn't very pretty. He still needed to get his order, get his situation a little more solid before he went charging after the Confederates. Buell had a public argument with him about it. Buell was furious. Buell considered himself a much better combat commander. He did report officially to Grant, but Buell was one of those. Buell felt he was the smarter man, the better general, and he should have been let loose to do what he wanted to do. He didn't do it. So there was no time for pursuit. They didn't do it. Next morning, though, there was one last clash. Next slide, please. Next morning, Grant sent Sherman and his 2 brigades and a regiment of cavalry and sent them towards Corinth to find out how far away the Confederates were. How far did they get during the night? They came out to a place which later became known as Fallen Timbers. This was... and again, Grant suffered from lack of cavalry. 6 miles to the southwest towards Corinth. It was known as Fallen Timbers because the locals had cleared a very large plot of land of trees. In a lot of places, the trees were still lying on their sides. But it was a big open clearing. In the middle of it was a Confederate field hospital, and there was one unit protecting the hospital. Nathan Bedford Forrest and 300 of his best troopers. You have 2 brigades under Sherman plus a regiment of cavalry coming across the field. You're Nathan Bedford Forrest. You've got 300 men. What's the proper command? Charge. Which he did. They did. They went in, cut up the Union forces. 77th Ohio was the first unit sent in to fight Forrest. They were the first to collide with Forrest. Forrest men threw him back. This is an entire regiment of infantry. Threw him back quite easily, and Forrest kept going. and which led to a problem. At one point, as he got close to the two brigades, he suddenly looked around and he realized he's out here by himself. His troopers are still fighting behind him or trying to catch up. And this led to one of the most famous incidents in the war. Force seemed to have a lot of these. One of the Union, the cry went out. They recognized him. Shoot him, shoot him. Well, he's a Confederate officer on a horse. I mean, obviously he's a great target. Shoot him, shoot him, shoot him. One Yankee soldier actually ran up to him, shoved his gun into his ribcage, pulled the trigger, and shot Nathan Bedford Forrest. It went in right above, he missed the ribcage, went right above the hit. The bullet stopped before it hit the spine. It lodged there. Forrest killed him and then rode away. I don't think this was the incident. There was an incident during the war where Forrest picked up a Union soldier who had tried to kill him and used him as a shield and rode away. This may have been that event, and this wasn't it. When did that happen? You remember? About a year later. Okay. Forrest rode away. This obviously contributed to his legend. Sherman, after getting the reports from this little fracas, decided, okay, he'd run into Breckinridge's rear elements while he was out searching around. He decided the Confederates were not planning to reattack. They were not reforming. They were heading for Corinth. So he called his troops back. The battle is over. Actually, on the 8th, after the fight at Fallen Timbers, Sherman and his men returned back to Pittsburg Landing. Next slide. Afterwards, a lot of second guessing. Some things don't change. Particularly in the northern press. You can see the casualty figures here. I'll tell you what, and remember, proportionately, admittedly, they both started the fight with about the same size forces, but the South could not afford to lose men at the same rate as the North. So 10,700 casualties for the South. It's probably the equivalent of 23,000, maybe more than equivalent to 23,000 for the northern troops. The press went after Grant big time. Started printing reports from his office, the old undisclosed sources. A senior government official. Grant was drunk. Grant wasn't at the battle. Grant was 10 miles away because he was afraid of a fight. Grant was 10 miles away because he was stupid. Grant was 10 miles away because he was stupid and drunk. This is where Grant really started running into problems with his reputation for drinking. Everything I've ever read indicates there was a couple, 3 times during the war where after a particularly bad fight, yeah, he got drunk. But he didn't stay drunk. He got back in the saddle and went right back into the fight. There was much uproar in the press and in Congress of his failure to destroy the Confederate Army. They kind of ignored the fact that Grant, Sherman, and their division commanders had managed to recover under difficult circumstances, had saved their army, and driven the Confederates from the battlefield. That counts as a victory. The press also released a lot of stories. I mentioned this earlier about poor defenseless Union troopers soldiers getting bayoneted in their haversacks, their sleeping kits, in their tents. They never got a good chance to fight because the Confederates came in so fast. There may have been some events where soldiers were bayoneted in their tents, but it wasn't widespread, according to the reports. Buell came out of this battle as the hero in the press. He was hoisted. He was a fast-rising star. The press and a lot in Congress were pushing for him for higher command in the United States Army. Conversely, Halleck demoted Grant after the battle while trying to sort out all the reports. And again, remember, Halleck didn't like Grant. Grant didn't like Halleck. And Grant stayed at a lower command until Halleck himself departed for the eastern to Washington, D.C. to become General-in-Chief of the U.S. Army, replacing George B. McClellan. What really came out of this, though, for the North, when all was said and done, Sherman staked his claim as a major hero for the North. Also, this is the battle that cemented Sherman and Grant's relationship with each other. They went through the rest of the war together, at least obviously through Chattanooga, where Sherman, as a subordinate, departed Chattanooga and went down to the sea at Savannah. And as I mentioned earlier, the other thing that stands out is up to this point, throughout entire American military history dating to the Revolution, or even the French and Indian if you want, this was the single costliest battle ever fought by American troops, on American soil or otherwise. For the South, it got worse. There were several more Union victories that followed. Island number 10 on the Mississippi fell April 1862. While this was going on, that fell to a Navy force. 18 to 29 April 1862, the Union fleet under Porter or Farragut? A Union fleet took New Orleans. That opened up the mouth at Farragut, opened up the mouth of the Mississippi. June 1862, Memphis fell. The entire Mississippi River then became Union property as far south as Memphis and north all the way from the Gulf to a little place called Port Hudson on the Mississippi. Now, I gave the Vicksburg presentation a couple of years ago. I can do it again. That was another campaign that followed to take out Vicksburg. The victories provided two direct paths into the interior of the South and threatened to split the Confederacy in two. And the other thing is, long-term, this freed up Grant to get to Vicksburg. You'll find out later if you study the coming year where Grant starts building his forces in Corinth for an overland invasion of Vicksburg, to come into the South, take Vicksburg out and this up and up the entire Mississippi River. A otherwise little-known general named Earl Van Dorn put an end to that plan. Grant responded with other plans. Eventually, Vicksburg fell, but that was another 15 months away. The war itself dragged on for 3 years. Finally, I don't know, hopefully most of you saw my email the other day. Do you have relatives that fought at Shiloh? Well, it turns out we have several. Bill Beasley, your great-great-grandfather, fought with Company I of the 44th Georgia, part of the Doyle Cook Brigade on the southern side at Shiloh. This gentleman here, why's your hand over the camera? Oh, there's the camera, okay. This gentleman here had relatives on both sides. Mr. Fulton here. Silas Sharpton, Company F, 38th Tennessee Looney's Regiment, fought for the South. John sent me his bio. He was later captured at Perryville, exchanged at Vicksburg, wounded at Peachtree Creek outside of Atlanta, right arm severely damaged. This photo was taken at a United Confederate Veterans Union in Gadsden, Georgia on 11 October 1916. There's Silas Simpson. And you can see his right arm is crooked. I guess that was a permanent condition. His arm was permanently in that position. On the other side of the fence, John's also related to James Plotner, Company K, 48th Illinois. 48th Illinois, if you remember from the maps, and again, just to visualize you will, the battlefield, as we saw, it was right in the middle of the fighting, right up here in the middle of the entire Union line. I did not get a chance to look up the 44th Georgia. The 38th Tennessee didn't show up on the battlefield maps. I believe they were held in reserves. But we have a direct connections here to the Battle of Shiloh, which was the biggest battle of the Western Theater. And it remained one of the biggest battles of the Western Theater, at least through Vicksburg and the whole Vicksburg campaign. I'll also mention Plotner's 48th Illinois. During the course of the Battle of Shiloh, went through 3 commanders. Colonel Haney, the original commander, seriously wounded. Lieutenant Colonel William Sanford assumed command in the middle of the battle, was seriously wounded. Eventually, Major Mayfield finished the battle with the 48th. If you have never been to Shiloh Battlefield, go. Just a second, Ron. I got you. You're first. It is one of the 4 original battlefield parks dating to the late 19th century. It is probably the most untouched. It is still rural land. It has not been heavily modified. It has not been heavily developed as compared to Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Antietam. Antietam's still pretty good shape. And Vicksburg. And or some later battles like Franklin, which is just completely covered. Yes, Ron?
My question was, you mentioned earlier, like 41st Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
41st Georgia, was that Shiloh? Minus the
Okay, so we got 3 connections here to the Battle of Shiloh. Okay.
Later after this campaign, we moved to 41st Georgia to Vicksburg.
Whoops. Okay. Sir?
We had a, what was it, great-great-grandfather or something, the name of William Sherman Beagle that fought for the 9th Union Regiment out of Tennessee.
Oh, really? The Union 9th Tennessee.
Union 9th, they had a,
At Shiloh, yeah.
9th, and they had a Union.
Right, yeah. Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, several states had forces on both sides.
He was a sergeant in that.
Okay. All right, well, I thank you for your attention. John will post it online. And again, I promise this is the last time you'll see me give a presentation this year because I think I'm wearing out my welcome. But anyway, do we have any other business for the evening? All right, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. If you could, please, as usual, help straighten up. Let's help Phil get all that good grub and drinks back to his car. Help Gail get his gear.